Massive protests against the Netanyahu government's proposed judicial reform have been underway in Israel since January. The corruption trial of Netanyahu and his ultra-right coalition partners has only added fuel to the fire and increasingly polarized Israeli society. As Israelis focus on domestic policies, international problems are also piling up. Iran remains a threat, and pro-Iranian groups are trying to take advantage of the chaos in Israel. As if that was not enough, relations with America are at their worst in years. What is happening in Israel? Is Netanyahu bringing the country to the brink of collapse? Welcome to the 20s Report. If you appreciate the video, consider leaving a like to help boost the algorithm. Israel's recent problems started in November 2018. At the time, there was an exchange of fire between the Israeli army and Hamas in the Gaza Strip. Ostensibly, this was just another episode in the years-long Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but the consequences of this episode quickly spiraled out of control. After 2 days of fighting with Hamas, Prime Minister Netanyahu decided to call a ceasefire. This was fiercely opposed by Avigdor Lieberman, Netanyahu's coalition partner and defense minister at the time. As a result, Lieberman resigned as minister and led his party out of the governing coalition. Admittedly, Netanyahu still had the majority in parliament, but only for a month. By December, the government was so divided that the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, was dissolved. Netanyahu, who had been prime minister continuously since 2009, was forced to fight for power in early elections. These were held in April 2019, and as expected, they were won by Bibi, as Netanyahu is referred to. Bibi won the most votes, but not enough to form a new government, so Israel fell into a veritable electoral merry-go-round. 5 rounds of general elections were held between 2019 and 2022. They all ended in Netanyahu's victory, but each time Bibi struggled to form a government. As a result, Israelis were forced to go to the ballot box every few months. The breakthrough came in the March 2021 elections. This time, his enemies from all sides of the political spectrum united against Netanyahu. A broad anti-Netanyahu coalition was formed, including nationalists, centrists, leftists, and even, for the first time in Israel's history, Arab politicians. The leaders of this exotic coalition were the centrist Yair Lapid and the right-winger, former Netanyahuite Naftali Bennett. They were divided by everything, but united by their shared aversion to Netanyahu, whom they ousted as prime minister after 12 years in power. It seemed to be the end of Netanyahu's brilliant political career. It was not only the fact that he had lost power, but also how it had happened. Bennett, who took his first steps in politics years ago as an advisor to Netanyahu, has now stabbed his mentor in the back. That was not the end of bad news for Netanyahu. In the Knesset, he sat on the opposition benches. What's more, he was put on the defendant's bench in court in a trial in which he was accused of bribery, fraud, and breach of trust. Just when it seemed that Bibi was finished, the indestructible Netanyahu was back in the game. In the summer of 2022, barely a year after the formation of the Lapid-Bennett duo, their exotic coalition fell apart. Another general election was called, the 5th in the last 4 years. This time, it turned out to be a major victory for the Israeli right. The camp centered around Netanyahu who won 64 of the 120 possible seats in the Knesset. Bibi regained his seat as prime minister. However, the price he paid for this was enormous. That's because Netanyahu had to form an alliance with 2 ultra-right parties, the Religious Zionist Party and the Jewish Power. And the price of joining the coalition was to hand over critical positions in the state to the ultra-right. The leader of religious Zionism, Bezalel Smotrich, became the new finance minister. He was also put in charge of the civil administration of the occupied West Bank. Jewish power leader Itamar Ben-Gewir became the new Minister of Internal Security. Smotrich and Ben-Gvir's views are radical, even compared to other right-wing groups in Israel. Both advocate the dismantling of the Palestinian Authority and the annexation of the West Bank. They also support increasing the powers of the military and losing the rules for soldiers to open fire, especially in the occupied territories. Particularly controversial is Ben-Gewir, who in his youth was associated with the chauvinist Kach party, which is listed as a terrorist organization in both Israel and the US. Netanyahu's decision to enter into a coalition with the radicals was not only unpopular with Bibi's closest associates, but also with the Biden administration, which tried to dissuade Netanyahu from allying with Ben-Gewir through unofficial channels. But Netanyahu had no choice. If he wanted to return to the prime minister's chair, the votes of Smotrich and Ben-Gewir were essential. Thus was formed a government that the media hailed as, quote, the most right-wing in Israel's history, unquote. By handing over key positions to Smotrich and Ben-Gewir, Netanyahu has significantly reduced his influence over the new government's policies. Alon Pinkas, a former Israeli diplomat, believes Netanyahu's position is weaker than ever, and his coalition partners know this and are ruthlessly exploiting it. Netanyahu may be back as a head of government, but he's being held hostage by his ultra-right coalition partners. The controversial judicial reform best illustrates the tensions within the ruling coalition and the influence of the coalition partners on the prime minister. In January 2023, Israel's Minister of Justice, Yariv Levin, presented a judicial reform project aimed at limiting the powers of the Supreme Court. Also, it should be remembered that Israel does not have a formal constitution, but the so-called fundamental rights. Levin's reform included changes to the process of electing judges, limiting the powers of the Supreme Court, and introducing the possibility for the Knesset to overturn its rulings. The opposition fiercely opposed the reform, claiming it is aimed at protecting politicians accused of corruption, such as Netanyahu or Aryeh Deri, the leader of the Shas party, who was convinced of bribery and stripped of his ministerial post by the High Court of Justice. The reform has divided the country and caused mass unrest among large sections of the population. A few days after Minister Levin presented his justice reform project in January 2023, large anti-government protests began in Israel, involving hundreds of thousands of people and paralyzing most major cities. Public opposition to the reform was so strong that in March, there was even a split within the Likud, Netanyahu's party. Netanyahu temporarily halted the reform to cool emotions and offered the opposition to work together on the project. As a very pragmatic politician, Netanyahu tried to find a compromise solution. But his coalition partners, led by Ben-Gewir, made it clear that either the reform would go ahead or they would leave the governing coalition. As a result, the Knesset resumed work on the project in the summer and passed the first law in the reform package in July, abolishing the Supreme Court's rationality test. This opened the door for Deri to return to the ministerial post he had been stripped of. The issue of judicial reform is currently the one that most electrifies public opinion in Israel. Since January, regular protests have attracted tens of hundreds of thousands of people each week. The longer the protests continue, the more the functioning of the state is affected. In February, Israel's central bank warned that judicial reform could harm the economy and discourage foreign investment in Israel. Some businessmen are threatening to pull their companies out of Israel. The protests also pose a threat to the state's defense capabilities. Indeed, reservists have become very active in the protests, threatening to stop reporting for mandatory reserve exercises if the Knesset passes the judicial reform. Israel's current situation was well summed up by Yuval Diskin, former head of the Shin Bet, Israel's counterintelligence service. Quote, Israel is on the brink of internal disintegration and severe social rift. It came much faster than I expected. We are liable to be on the brink of civil war, and this is because our miserable government." Unquote. While the fears of civil war seem somewhat exaggerated, the possibility of bloodshed on the streets of Israel cannot be ruled out, especially as Netanyahu's coalition partners are trying to form pro-government militias that could be used to break up the protests. When Netanyahu halted work on judicial reform for several weeks in March to cool public opinion, Ben-Gewir threatened to quit the government. He abandoned the plan only after Netanyahu agreed to create a National Guard that would report directly to the Internal Security Ministry, which Ben-Gewir heads. Critics of the government claim that Ben-Gewir wants to legalize militias to break up protests. The idea has been even criticized by the current defense minister, Yoav Gallant, who said there is no place for, quote, private armies in Israel. With each passing week of work on judicial reform, Israel's internal situation becomes more complicated. Meanwhile, the country's international situation does not inspire optimism either. When Prime Minister Netanyahu signed the Abrahamic Accords with the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain and Morocco in Washington in September 2020, it seemed that a window of great opportunity had opened for Israel. With the support of President Trump's administration, Israel had the chance to build a, quote, Middle East NATO, unquote, a broad front against Tehran and the pro-Iranian militias operating in the region. Time has painfully verified these hopes. The Abrahamic Accords did not lead to the formation of a pro-Iranian alliance. Quite simply, seeing the failure of US policy towards Iran, the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia began to reset relations with the Iranians on their own. In 2022, the Emirati ambassador returned to Tehran for the first time in 6 years. In early 2023, an agreement was signed in China to normalize Saudi-Iranian relations. The Israelis believe that the relaxation in Arab-Iranian relations is temporary, and that it is only a matter of time before things heat up again in the Gulf. Therefore, Israel hopes that Saudi Arabia will eventually join the Abrahamic Accords, reviving the discussion about a common anti-Iranian front. Similar hopes are held by the Joe Biden administration, which believes that a negotiated peace agreement between Israel and Saudi Arabia could improve the ratings of President Biden, who is up for re-election next year. Despite US and Israeli diplomacy efforts, Saudi Arabia's accession to the peace accords is currently unrealistic. This is because the Saudis impose prohibitive conditions that neither the US nor Israel can accept. For example, the kingdom demands support for its nuclear program and US security guarantees similar to those of NATO countries. The Saudis are also demanding an independent Palestine, which Netanyahu cannot accept, especially given the composition of the current government coalition. So the deal with the Arabs is moving away, and in the meantime, the threat from Iran, Israel's greatest enemy, is still accurate. The Donald Trump administration campaign of maximum pressure on Tehran has failed. The Americans pulled out of the nuclear deal and imposed crippling sanctions on almost every sector of the Iranian economy. But even this did not force the Ayatollahs to make concessions. Trump is no longer in the White House, nor is the nuclear deal, but the consequences remain. Iran, just like in 2015, is once again very close to building a nuclear bomb. Although the Biden administration tried to talk to the Iranians and return to the nuclear deal, the US efforts ultimately came to nothing. The fact is that the US is tired of the Iran issue, especially as the Americans have enough problems with Russia and China. A growing number of reports suggest that Washington would be even content with an unofficial agreement with the Iranians. Tehran would give up uranium enrichment above 60% and halt arms sales to Russia, whereas the Americans would give tacit approval for Iranian oil to return to world markets. This would be a disastrous scenario for Israel. It would mean that the issue of Iran's nuclear program would enter a state of limbo that would last for years. during which Israel would have to pour substantial financial resources into keeping the army ready to confront Iran. The problem is not just Tehran, but the whole pro-Iranian network in the region. From Israel's point of view, the presence of Iranian influence in neighboring Syria and Lebanon is particularly problematic. Assad survived the civil war and now controls most of the country. Arab countries that only a few years ago wanted Assad to be overthrown have now come to terms with his victory. At the Arab League summit in May, Syria was reinstated as a member of the organization. For Israel, this is devastating news because the warmer Assad's relations with Arab leaders become, the more Israel will be criticized for bombing Syria. And this is the only tool Israel has to sabotage Iranian operations inside Syria. The situation in neighboring Lebanon is also highly unfavorable. Lebanon is now a failed state, economically bankrupt, and in a permanent political crisis from 2019. Israel hoped that such a state of affairs would strengthen anti-Hezbollah sentiment, but nothing of the sort has happened. Not only does Hezbollah operate perfectly within the Lebanese chaos, but it also tries to take advantage of the political anarchy that prevails in Israel. Quote, Israel, once a formidable regional power, has gradually eroded in faith, consciousness, self-confidence, and humility, leading to the crisis it is currently experiencing. It is undoubtedly the worst day in the history of the Zionist entity, unquote, said Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah at the end of July. The number of Hezbollah provocations on the Israeli-Lebanese border is steadily increasing, with some in the military expressing concern that Nasrallah's ultimate goal is to provoke Netanyahu into sending troops into southern Lebanon, which would further exacerbate divisions in Israel. The Israeli forces have not taken a break in the occupied territories either. Since last autumn, when Israel had its general elections, the number of attacks in the occupied West Bank has steadily increased. These attacks are not only carried out by Palestinians, but also by Jewish settlers living in illegal settlements in the West Bank. The West Bank came under Israeli occupation in 1967 due to the Six-Day War. Although illegal under international law, more and more Jewish settlements are being built in the West Bank. In fact, their number is growing exponentially. In the early 1970s, only about 1,000 Jewish settlers were in the West Bank. Today, there are around 490,000. However, the destabilization of the West Bank is not only due to tensions between Palestinians and Jewish settlers, but also to divisions within the Palestinian community itself. Support for the Palestinian Authority and Fatah, which governs the West Bank, is waning. Polls show that nearly 3/4 of Palestinians want Mahmoud Abbas to step down. His term as president ended in 2009, but he continued to head the Palestinian Authority in the absence of elections. Dissatisfaction with Fatah's rule leads to increasing radicalization among young Palestinians, who are joining more radical groups such as Hamas and Islamic Jihad. Netanyahu's coalition partners also exacerbate the situation in the occupied West Bank. Smotrich, who heads the civil administration in the West Bank, permits Jewish settlers to break the law. Similarly, some of Ben-Gevir's actions as Minister of Internal Security can be seen as enticing the settlers to further escalation. Palestinians fear that the actions of Smotrich and Ben-Gewir will ultimately lead to the annexation of the Israeli-occupied territories and the end of the idea of an independent Palestine. The situation in the West Bank is now so tense that some commentators even talk of a third intifada. But, after all, in crisis, Israel can always count on the United States, its main ally. But can it? This special relationship has gone through deep trouble in recent years. There are several reasons for this. Washington believes that Israel is sabotaging US efforts to end the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The Americans advocate a two-state options, meaning the coexistence of an independent Israel and an independent Palestine. The expansion of illegal Jewish settlements undermines American peace efforts. The Americans also have growing doubts about the progressive rapprochement between Israel and China in recent years. Among other things, the Americans have criticized outsourcing the management of the strategic port of Haifa to the Chinese Shanghai International Port Group. The personal dislike between Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Biden is also no secret. The Democrats resent Netanyahu's close contacts with Donald Trump. The White House is also unhappy with the presence of the radical right in the Israeli government. The magic of bitterness, on the other hand, was poured over the judicial reform. When Biden expressed his doubts about the reform, Ben-Gewir responded very harshly, quote, "Israel is not another star on the American flag," unquote. The crisis between Israel and the US is so great that some politicians have even questioned the legitimacy of the US continuing its financial aid to Israel, which amounts to $3.8 billion annually. Daniel Kurtzer, former US ambassador to Israel, put it bluntly, quote, "The aid provides the US with no leverage or influence over Israeli decisions to use force. US aid provides a multi-billion-dollar cushion that allows Israel to avoid hard choices of where to spend its own money, and thus allows Israel to spend more money on policies we oppose, such as settlements," unquote. The Netanyahu camp seems to think it can wait out the crisis in relations with America. After all, if Donald Trump wins the 2024 presidential election, a great friend of Israel and Prime Minister Netanyahu will be back in the White House. Such a policy is short-sighted, however, because it leads to Israel building its relationship with Washington on a Republican rather than a bipartisan basis. And this is already a problem, as US polls clearly show. In a 2023 Gallup poll, 54% of Americans supported Israel in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But when respondents' party affiliation broke down these results, two very different pictures emerged. As many as 78% of Republicans sympathized with Israel, whereas nearly half of Democrats said they sympathized with the Palestinians. Wars for Israel polls show that younger generations increasingly favor Palestine rather than Israel. According to the same 2023 Gallup poll, more than 50% of baby boomers sympathize with Israel. But among millennials, sympathy is fairly even divided, with 42% for Palestine and 40% for Israel. It is doubtful that America will withdraw its financial support for Israel in the coming years. However, it is reasonable to assume that as generations change, voices critical of Israel will become more common in America, making it harder to sustain the current nature of the US-Israel relationship. Israel is at a crossroads. The rule of Netanyahu and his ultra-right coalition partners is polarizing Israeli society, and judicial reform pushes the country to the brink of internal disintegration. While Israelis are preoccupied with domestic politics, problems on the international stage are gathering pace. Dreams of a broad anti-Iranian front have been brutally tested. The issue of Iran's nuclear program remains unresolved, and the White House is increasingly critical of the Israeli government's actions. Netanyahu's team seems wholly absorbed in domestic politics, without noticing or downplaying Israel's problems on the international stage. Netanyahu is a pragmatist, but his coalition partners are limiting his room for maneuver and putting the government on a collision course with the opposition and America. All of Israel's problems could be solved by Donald Trump's return to the White House, or so Bibi seems to think. It would be then possible to return to Trump's Middle East peace plan, favorable to Israel, and to play an aggressive game with Iran again. But if Trump does not return to the White House, Israel's problems will only worsen, and even a skilled politician like Netanyahu will find it hard to control the chaos he has created. And so Israel's everlasting war continues, both externally, United States' traditional rivals, but perhaps worse, internally, as the struggle for power and influence increasingly divides the Israeli people. Recently I had a meeting with a YouTube analyst, and she suggested that if I want the channel to grow, I should ask our audience for feedback to help boost the algorithm. So if you liked this material, please press the thumbs up button or write a comment. You may also consider supporting us on Patreon.